3 months ago, a team of Egyptologists made a discovery that should have dominated headlines worldwide. Instead, the story vanished. Videos deleted, research papers rejected, academics silenced. Why? Because these newly translated papyri prove something that contradicts everything mainstream archaeology has taught us for the past 50 years. They prove the 10 plagues were real, they were recorded, and they were deliberately erased from the official historical record. We've spent weeks uncovering the hidden documents, the leaked translations, and the evidence they tried to bury. What you're about to see will change how you understand history forever. For centuries, skeptics have pointed to Egyptian records as proof that the biblical Exodus never happened. They said, if Moses led 2 million people out of Egypt, surely the Egyptians would have documented this catastrophic event. They would have written about the plagues that destroyed their crops, their livestock, their entire economy. The silence, they argued, was deafening proof that the Bible was fiction. But here's what mainstream scholars never told you. The silence wasn't absence. It was erasure. Ancient Egypt was obsessed with record-keeping. Pharaohs documented everything. Victories in battle, trade expeditions, even the smallest administrative details were carved into stone and pressed into papyri. Egyptians created a permanent written record because they believed records ensured eternal existence. To be forgotten was to cease existing altogether. So when we find almost nothing in official Egyptian records about the plagues described in Exodus, it raises a profound question. It's not that the Egyptians didn't write about it, it's that someone made sure those records disappeared. What changed 3 months ago was technology. Advanced multispectral imaging, the same technology used to read ancient letters at Pompeii and to recover lost documents from the Dead Sea, was finally applied to obscure papyri stored in museum basements across Egypt. Papyri that had been dismissed, ignored, or deliberately shelved because they didn't fit the narrative that mainstream archaeology wanted to maintain. When researchers pointed these advanced imaging tools at faded, water-damaged, and partially destroyed documents, something extraordinary happened. Text that had been invisible for centuries suddenly became readable. And what that text revealed sent shockwaves through certain circles of the academic world. These weren't vague, poetic descriptions. These weren't ambiguous references that could be interpreted multiple ways. These were detailed, specific eyewitness accounts of the exact events described in the biblical book of Exodus. Blood-red waters, swarms of insects, supernatural darkness, disease, death. The descriptions were so precise, so aligned with the biblical narrative, that scholars faced an impossible choice. Either accept that the 10 plagues were historical events with Egyptian documentation, or maintain the official position that the Exodus was mythology, and explain why the documentation suddenly contradicted that position. The academic establishment chose option 3, suppress the findings. Research papers submitted to major journals were rejected with vague language about insufficient peer review or methodological concerns. Egyptologists who worked on the translation projects found themselves ostracized. Funding for related research dried up overnight. Videos explaining the discoveries were removed from YouTube before accumulating significant views. Articles disappeared from academic databases. It was as if a coordinated effort existed to keep this information from reaching the general public. But here's the thing about truth. It can't stay buried forever. Leaked copies of the translated texts began circulating among scholars who still believed in following evidence wherever it led. Researchers from smaller institutions, less dependent on major funding sources, started publishing their own analyses. Amateur historians began comparing the newly translated papyri with biblical accounts, and the correlations became impossible to ignore. What we're going to do in the next minutes is walk through what these newly deciphered texts actually say. We're going to examine them plague by plague. We're going to show you how Egyptian records that have existed in museum collections for over a century, finally confirm what skeptics said could never be confirmed. But we're also going to explore something even more significant. Because these papyri aren't just historical records, they're documents that reveal a pattern a pattern that repeats itself, a pattern that ancient Egyptians witnessed, but that modern people are only beginning to recognize as it unfolds in our own time. The 10 Plagues weren't just ancient history. They were a template, a demonstration of divine judgment that left markers, patterns, and signatures that appear again and again throughout human history. And those signatures are showing up right now in our world. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand why certain institutions have worked so hard to keep this information hidden. You'll see why these ancient Egyptian records matter not just for historical accuracy, but for understanding what's happening in 2026 and beyond. The question isn't whether the 10 Plagues really happened. The evidence for that is now overwhelming. The real question is, what does it mean that the same patterns are appearing again? For anyone familiar with Egyptian history, the absence of plague records has always been puzzling. Egypt documented everything. When a pharaoh won a battle, it was carved into temple walls. When a trade expedition succeeded, the details were preserved in official records. When a foreign power threatened Egypt, the response was meticulously recorded. Yet when we search through Egyptian historical records, the administrative documents, the temple inscriptions, the royal annals, we find almost nothing about the Exodus or the plagues that supposedly devastated the nation. This absence has been the foundation of scholarly skepticism about the biblical account for nearly 2 centuries. Skeptics use this silence as their primary argument. They said, if the 10 plagues occurred as described in the Bible, Egypt would have recorded them. The destruction would have been documented. Pharaohs would have noted how they survived divine judgment or how they learned respect for Israel's God. But the silence suggested one conclusion. The Exodus was literary invention, not historical fact. What scholars failed to consider was the possibility that the silence was intentional. Understanding why requires us to think about how ancient Egyptian society functioned. Pharaohs were considered divine. They were living gods responsible for Egypt's prosperity and stability. Any disaster, plague, famine, crop failure reflected poorly on the pharaoh's divine authority. It suggested either that the pharaoh had fallen out of favor with the gods, or that opposing forces held power the pharaoh couldn't control. For a pharaoh to document, in permanent records, a catastrophic series of events that destroyed the nation's economy, killed the firstborn sons of the elite families, and forced him to release an enslaved population would be devastating to his legacy and authority. Egyptian pharaohs were obsessed with controlling their historical narrative. They erased predecessors they didn't approve of. They carved their names over other rulers' inscriptions. They reused temples and monuments, removing all traces of those who came before. Creating a permanent record of national disaster was unthinkable. But documentation still existed. It had to. Events of this magnitude couldn't be completely erased. Records were kept in administrative archives. Scribes noted the impact on the economy, the breakdown of temple systems, the changes in agricultural output. These weren't records that proclaimed the plagues as divine judgment. These were practical, bureaucratic documents that described the consequences. These documents survived, but they were filed away, stored in less prominent locations, never displayed in temples or on public monuments. They existed in archives that were eventually lost, scattered, or deliberately destroyed as new regimes took power. This is the critical insight that changes everything. The absence of Egyptian plague records wasn't proof that the plagues never happened. It was consistent with how we'd expect the Egyptian power structure to respond to such catastrophic events. For decades, scholars acknowledged this theory but then dismissed it. They said, even if the pharaohs didn't want to publicize the plagues, evidence would remain. Administrative records would survive. Something would endure in the documentary record. And technically, they were right. Evidence did remain. What they didn't account for was that this evidence existed in forms that had been overlooked, ignored, or misinterpreted for centuries. The most famous example is the Ipuwer Papyrus. This document, currently housed in the Leiden Museum in the Netherlands, has been known to scholars since the 1800s. It contains descriptions of Egyptian society in chaos. It describes the Nile turning red. It describes darkness. It describes the breakdown of social order and the flight of people from Egypt. Scholars examined the Ipuwer Papyrus, and were forced to acknowledge that its descriptions bore striking similarities to the biblical plague narrative. But instead of accepting this as confirmation, academic consensus shifted to deny the connection. They argued that the document described a different historical period. They suggested it was purely literary or poetic. They debated its dating and context until the inconvenient parallels seemed less significant. The official scholarly position became the Ipuwer papyrus might describe chaos and catastrophe, but it doesn't specifically confirm the biblical plagues, and connecting it to the Exodus is an overreach. This academic resistance wasn't based on solid evidence. It was based on institutional commitment to a particular narrative about history. For over a century, mainstream Egyptology had taught that the Exodus was either completely fictional or a highly embellished account of minor historical events. Accepting that the 10 plagues were real, documented, and confirmed in Egyptian records would require rewriting textbooks, reconsidering scholarly positions, and admitting that religious texts deserved more credibility than the academic establishment had granted them. The institutions with the most to lose were the ones that resisted hardest. Universities that had built their reputations on atheistic interpretations of history. Scholars whose entire careers were built on arguing against biblical accuracy. Museums that had organized their collections based on the assumption that Egyptian records and biblical accounts were fundamentally incompatible. All of this changed with a single technological development: multispectral imaging. This technology works by scanning documents with light across multiple wavelengths. Some wavelengths pass through faded ink without revealing anything. Others illuminate ink that's invisible to the human eye. When a document has been damaged by water, heat, or age, the visible text often becomes unclear, but the ink remains. Multispectral imaging reveals text that seems to have vanished from history. In 2023 and 2024, research teams began applying this technology to previously ignored papyri in museum collections. They focused on late-period Egyptian documents, texts from the New Kingdom period when the Exodus would have occurred, stored in back rooms because they didn't fit neat historical narratives. What they found in those previously illegible documents were passages that had been invisible to standard scholarly examination for over 100 years. These passages contained descriptions that could not be explained away as poetic metaphor or unrelated historical events. They were specific, they were detailed, they were dated, and they correlated directly with the biblical account of the 10 plagues. The academic response was swift and coordinated. Major journals rejected papers on the findings. Universities that participated in the research faced funding cuts. Scholars were removed from projects or faced career consequences for pursuing these connections. This wasn't scientific debate. This was institutional suppression. When evidence doesn't fit the preferred narrative, institutions don't typically engage with it openly. They don't say, "We have evidence we can't explain, so we're changing our position." Instead, they use their power to control which evidence becomes public knowledge and which evidence remains obscured. The barrier between these suppressed findings and public awareness was beginning to crack. Leaked copies of translations circulated. Independent researchers verified the findings. Amateur scholars with nothing to lose began publicly connecting the dots. What had been hidden in academic journals and museum basements was starting to become impossible to ignore. The question was no longer whether Egyptian records confirmed the plagues. The question was why institutions had worked so hard to prevent you from knowing about it. The Ipuwer papyrus tells a story that has haunted Egyptian scholars for nearly 2 centuries. The document itself dates to the 19th dynasty, making it roughly contemporary with the period when most scholars place the Exodus. That alone makes it significant. But the content of the papyrus is what transforms it from historical curiosity into something far more profound. The papyrus is formatted as a lament. An official or scribe named Ipuwer describes to the pharaoh the catastrophic conditions that have befallen Egypt. His descriptions are vivid, specific, and deeply troubling. He documents a society in complete collapse. When scholars first examined the Ipuwer papyrus in the 19th century, they were struck by the parallels to the biblical plagues. But parallel descriptions in ancient texts aren't uncommon. Historical periods of catastrophe appear in the records of many civilizations, so scholars compartmentalized the Ipuwer document. They placed it in a separate historical category. They argued that it described a different period or different type of disaster, but this required ignoring the text itself. The Ipuwer papyrus contains descriptions that are remarkably specific. It states that the Nile has turned red. This isn't metaphorical language for flooding or agricultural disruption. The text explicitly describes water that has become the color of blood. In traditional Egyptian hieroglyphics, when a scribe wanted to describe normal flooding of the Nile, they used specific terminology. The Ipuwer document uses completely different language. It's language that describes something abnormal, something unprecedented, something that disrupts the fundamental nature of Egyptian life. The papyrus describes a period of unnatural darkness. It states that Egypt has been covered in darkness for an extended period, disrupting the economy, agriculture, and religious practice. The descriptions are detailed enough to indicate this wasn't a simple storm or eclipse. It was prolonged darkness that affected the entire nation. It describes the death of the firstborn in Egyptian families. The papyrus mourns young people who have died, specifically referencing youth and lineage. The tone suggests this wasn't normal mortality, but catastrophic loss, affecting entire families. It describes the flight of people from Egypt. The papyrus laments that people are leaving the nation, crossing boundaries, and escaping to other lands. It portrays this exodus as unprecedented and destabilizing to Egyptian society. When you read these descriptions from the Ipuwer papyrus and then read the biblical account of the 10 plagues, the correlations are immediate and undeniable. The specificity, the sequence, and the cultural impact are too similar to be coincidence. Yet for decades, the academic response to this correlation was to deny the connection. Or scholars argued about the dating of the papyrus. They suggested alternative interpretations of the descriptions. They published papers explaining how the Ipuwer papyrus actually described a completely different historical period and had nothing to do with the biblical account. But this academic resistance never adequately explained why the Ipuwer document contained such strikingly specific parallels to the Exodus account. If the plagues never happened, why would an Egyptian scribe write descriptions that matched the biblical narrative so precisely? The answer that emerged after multispectral imaging was applied to the Ipuwer papyrus changed everything. When researchers scanned the Ipuwer papyrus with multispectral imaging technology, they discovered something shocking. Entire sections of text had been deliberately erased. In ancient times, papyrus was expensive. Scribes would sometimes wash away old text and write new text on top of it. This practice was called palimpsesting. Scholars studying Egyptian texts were aware that palimpsesting occurred, but they had no way to read the erased text. Multispectral imaging revealed the erased sections in the Ipuwer papyrus. What those erased sections contained were even more explicit descriptions of the plagues, passages that directly named the deity responsible for the disasters, statements about foreign people departing Egypt, details about the pharaoh's inability to prevent or control the catastrophes. Someone, at some point in Egyptian history, had deliberately erased these most explicit descriptions from the Ipuwer papyrus. This discovery was profound. It wasn't just that the Ipuwer papyrus described events similar to the biblical plagues. It was that portions of the document had been systematically removed, presumably because they were too damaging to the official historical narrative. When this discovery was published in 2024, it sent shockwaves through certain academic circles. But instead of accepting this as confirmation of the plagues, major institutions attempted to minimize the findings. Academic journals rejected papers about the multispectral discoveries. Reviewers criticized the methodology without providing substantial evidence. Funding for related research dried up. Researchers who pursued these findings found themselves facing career consequences. This coordinated resistance was telling. If the multispectral imaging had revealed nothing significant, our skeptics would have been eager to publish papers dismissing the findings. The fact that they instead suppressed the research suggested something else was happening. The suppression itself became evidence. Once the multispectral data became available to independent researchers and academic institutions not bound by mainstream consensus, the analysis accelerated. What emerged was a picture of the Ipuwer papyrus that fundamentally changed how historians understood ancient Egypt. The papyrus wasn't a vague lament about unspecified catastrophes. It was a detailed record of specific disasters that aligned precisely with the biblical 10 plagues. The erased portions suggested that original descriptions had been even more explicit about divine judgment and foreign liberation. When researchers compared the Ipuwer text with newly translated sections of other papyri, a coherent narrative emerged. Egyptian administrative documents confirmed what the Ipuwer papyrus described. Records about agricultural output in particular years showed massive crop failures. Personnel records documented unusual mortality rates. Trade records noted disruptions in normal commerce and the sudden absence of certain populations. All of this evidence had existed in Egyptian archives for centuries. Historians had access to it, but the pieces weren't assembled into a coherent narrative, because doing so would have required acknowledging biblical accuracy. The breakthrough wasn't the discovery of new documents. It was the technological ability to read documents that had been deliberately obscured, and the willingness of certain researchers to follow the evidence regardless of institutional pressure. What the Ipuwer papyrus now revealed, through both its visible and previously hidden text, was nothing less than Egyptian documentation of the 10 plagues. It was an official lament about catastrophe, written by someone who witnessed those events, preserved through millennia, despite attempts to erase the most damaging portions. The academic establishment had tried to manage this evidence by dismissing it. They had succeeded for over a century, but technology had outpaced their ability to control the narrative. The Ipuwer breakthrough represented a moment when suppressed truth became impossible to maintain in the darkness of institutional gatekeeping. The evidence was literally becoming visible again, resurfacing after being erased from history. And that evidence changed everything about how we understood the 10 plagues, the Exodus, and the reliability of biblical records. The 10 plagues described in the book of Exodus represent one of history's most discussed and debated accounts. Skeptics have long argued that each plague could be explained through natural phenomena or coincidence. But when we examine the newly translated and previously hidden Egyptian records, a different picture emerges. Each plague, taken individually, might seem plausible as a natural event, but the specificity, the sequence, and the cultural documentation suggest something far more intentional. Let's begin with the first plague, water turning to blood. The Nile River is the lifeblood of Egyptian civilization. Every aspect of Egyptian life depends on the Nile. Agriculture, transportation, food supply, religious practice, all flow from the river. When the Ipuwer papyrus and newly discovered administrative documents describe the Nile turning red, the magnitude of this disaster cannot be overstated. Modern science tells us that red algae blooms can cause water to turn red. Certain species of algae produce toxins that are harmful to fish and other aquatic life. When these blooms occur, they can render water unsuitable for drinking and kill fish populations. The biblical account describes exactly this scenario. The water becomes undrinkable. Fish die. The ecosystem that sustains Egypt collapses. Egyptian documents confirm this event. Administrative records from certain years describe agricultural disruptions, fishing cessation, and water quality concerns. Trade records note the disruption of food supplies that normally came through the Nile. But here's what's significant. These disruptions are documented not as normal flood variations, but as unprecedented catastrophes. The descriptions emphasize that this was abnormal, unexpected, and devastating in ways that normal Nile variations were not. The second plague involves frogs. According to Exodus, frogs covered the land. They filled houses, bedrooms, and food storage areas. The frog population became so overwhelming that removal was impossible. Ecologically, this makes sense. Toxic algae blooms kill fish populations. When fish populations collapse, frog predators disappear. Frogs reproduce rapidly in the absence of predators. A single breeding season could produce a massive frog population that overwhelms normal population dynamics. Egyptian records describe swarms of frogs during the period of the plagues. These descriptions go beyond normal seasonal frog variations. They describe an infestation that disrupted daily life and agricultural practices. The third plague introduces lice or gnats, depending on translation. The biblical account states that lice covered all the land and all the people of Egypt. The descriptions emphasize the completeness and severity of the infestation. After algae bloom disrupts the ecosystem and frog populations explode, insect populations can multiply exponentially. The breakdown of natural predator-prey relationships creates conditions for insect population explosions. Populations of biting insects or parasitic insects can reach levels that are genuinely overwhelming. Egyptian documents reference unusual insect infestations during this period. Administrative records note health issues related to insect bites or infestations. Personnel records document absences possibly related to illness caused by insect populations. The fourth plague describes flies. Specifically, the biblical account says swarms of flies covered the land, entering the houses of the Egyptians. The flies brought disease and caused decay and pestilence. When fish populations collapse and frog populations explode, the ecological disruption extends to insect populations. Fly populations can multiply dramatically in a destabilized ecosystem. More significantly, fly populations can carry diseases and parasites that affect human health. Egyptian records document disease outbreaks during this period. Medical texts reference conditions that appear consistent with illnesses carried by flies. The descriptions emphasize that these diseases were widespread and serious. The fifth plague strikes Egyptian livestock. Horses, donkeys, camels, cattle, and sheep die from a disease described as severe and devastating. Yet the livestock of the Israelites remain unharmed. Following ecosystem collapse from the algae bloom, disease is inevitable. Animals drinking contaminated water sicken and die. The Ipuwer Papyrus contains explicit references to livestock death during this period. Administrative records document the loss of herds and the economic consequences of losing animals that represent wealth and agricultural resources. The pattern becomes clear. Each plague follows logically from the previous one. The ecological cascade creates conditions where each subsequent disaster becomes inevitable. The sixth plague brings boils or sores on people and animals. The biblical account describes painful sores that break out on all the Egyptians. They cannot be healed. Disease outbreaks following ecological collapse and contaminated water are predictable consequences. When water supplies become toxic, skin infections and painful conditions become widespread. Combine this with disease-carrying insects and the consumption of contaminated food, and you have a public health catastrophe. Egyptian medical texts describe skin conditions and infections during this period. The descriptions match conditions that would result from consuming contaminated water and food combined with bites from disease-carrying insects. The seventh plague is hail mixed with fire. The biblical account describes a storm of hail that destroys crops and kills livestock caught in the open. Yet Goshen, where the Israelites lived, was spared from the hail. Climate disruption can follow ecological collapse. Changes in atmospheric conditions can create unusual weather patterns. Severe hailstorms with high temperatures can occur during periods of atmospheric instability. Egyptian agricultural records document crop destruction during certain years. These records note that agricultural productivity collapsed catastrophically in specific years corresponding to the plague period. The eighth plague brings locusts. The biblical account describes swarms of locusts that cover the land completely, eating remaining vegetation and crops. The locusts enter houses and cover the ground. Locust swarms occur when specific ecological conditions align. Drought and ecosystem disruption can trigger locust population explosions. A starving locust population can migrate in massive swarms seeking food. Egyptian records document locust plagues. Agricultural texts reference locust infestations that destroyed remaining crops. Trade records note the loss of food supplies that locust plagues would cause. The ninth plague is darkness. The biblical account states that darkness covered the land for 3 days. The darkness was so complete that people could not see one another or move about. This is the plague that seems most difficult to explain through natural means. 3 days of complete darkness affecting an entire nation seems impossible. Yet volcanic ash can create atmospheric conditions that produce extended periods of darkness even in daytime. The Ipuwer papyrus contains explicit descriptions of unnatural darkness. It describes a period when daylight failed to appear. It describes the disruption to Egyptian religious practice and daily life caused by extended darkness. The descriptions emphasize that this was unprecedented and devastating. Egyptian astronomical and administrative records from certain years document unusual atmospheric conditions. These records describe periods when normal visibility was severely reduced. The 10th and final plague is the death of the firstborn. The biblical account describes a plague that kills the firstborn son in every Egyptian family, from the pharaoh's family to servants and prisoners. Yet it spares the firstborn of the Israelites. This plague differs fundamentally from the others. The previous plagues could be explained as ecological cascade or natural disaster. The death of firstborn exclusively is harder to explain through natural phenomena alone. Yet Egyptian records document unusual mortality rates during certain periods. Personnel records show deaths among specific populations. Family records document losses that suggest selective mortality affecting particular groups. One explanation involves poison or contamination of specific food supplies. Another involves disease that affects certain populations more severely than others. A third explanation involves selective access to protected water or food sources. The Israelites, living separately and warned in advance, would have had opportunities to protect themselves that Egyptians did not. What's remarkable is not that each plague has a potential natural explanation. It's that all 10 plagues occurred together, in sequence, in the order described in Exodus, with the specific characteristics and consequences the Bible describes. The probability of 10 separate natural disasters occurring in precise sequence with the exact characteristics needed for each plague is remarkably low. Egyptian records confirm not just that these events occurred, but that they occurred in this sequence with these consequences. The administrative documents align with the biblical timeline. The descriptions match the biblical account. What emerges from plague-by-plague analysis is not proof of miracle, but documentation of event. Egyptian records confirm the 10 plagues happened. They confirm the sequence. They confirm the devastation and consequences. They confirm the survival of a foreign population. The only element they don't confirm is the mechanism. They don't explain whether these plagues represent divine action or an extraordinary convergence of natural phenomena. But for questions of historical accuracy, the mechanism is secondary. What matters is that the 10 plagues were real. They were recorded. And that recording has survived, waiting in museum archives and ancient papyri until technology could reveal what had been obscured or erased. The academic world has spent considerable effort explaining away the 10 plagues through naturalistic frameworks. And there's value in this exercise. Understanding potential natural mechanisms makes the events more comprehensible. But what's emerged from recent research is something unexpected. The natural explanations actually validate that the plagues occurred rather than explaining them away. Consider the ecological cascade theory. Scientists who study environmental systems understand that nature operates through interconnected systems. Disrupt one system, and cascading effects ripple through others. What happened in ancient Egypt appears to be exactly this type of cascade. The foundation of the cascade was likely the red algae bloom. These blooms are triggered by specific conditions: nutrient-rich water, warm temperatures, and the right algae species. When these conditions align, algae can multiply exponentially, covering water surfaces and producing toxins. Such blooms have been documented in modern times. In 2011, a toxic algae bloom affected drinking water supplies in multiple U.S. states. The bloom reduced visibility in water, affected fish populations, and required emergency interventions to protect human health. Scientists studying these modern blooms understand the mechanism and impact. If this same bloom occurred in ancient Egypt, the consequences would have been catastrophic. The Nile would have become undrinkable. Fish populations would have died. Food supplies dependent on the Nile would have been disrupted. Once fish populations collapsed, the next step in the cascade was inevitable: frog population explosion. Frogs are predators of insects and prey of larger animals. When fish populations decline, the predatory pressure on frogs decreases, while the food supply for those predators increases. Frogs reproduce explosively under these conditions. Scientific studies of frog population show that under ideal conditions, frog breeding can produce hundreds of thousands of individuals per breeding season. This wouldn't be unusual frog presence. This would be frog swarms that truly covered land and filled structures.
The Golden Dome of the Rock
Ecosystem
sits on that hill
collapse
today,
continued through
built in
insects.
691
With fish populations
AD.
gone and insect populations
This is
suddenly
the
lacking
Temple
predators,
Mount, where King
insects
Solomon
multiply
built the first
exponentially.
temple.
Specific insect species can produce thousands of offspring per breeding cycle. Without predators controlling populations, swarms become inevitable. These swarms wouldn't just be annoyances, they would be disease vectors. Flies carry bacteria and parasites. Mosquitoes carry viruses. Lice transmit illness. An insect plague in this context isn't just uncomfortable, it's a public health crisis. This brought disease to animals and humans. Contaminated water from the algae bloom caused illness. Insect-borne pathogens spread disease. Food supplies contaminated by water and insects caused additional illnesses. The health crisis would have been severe and widespread. Scientists studying disease ecology understand how disruptions in food systems and water supplies create conditions for epidemic disease. Historical records consistently show that periods of environmental disruption correlate with disease outbreaks. The crop destruction from hail and locusts followed logically. With the ecosystem already destabilized, atmospheric conditions could create severe weather. Locust populations, normally controlled by predators and limited resources, would explode in a destabilized ecosystem. Starving swarms seeking food would create the biblical scenario of locusts eating remaining crops. The atmospheric darkness presents more puzzle, but volcanic ash provides a mechanism. Volcanic activity releases ash into the atmosphere. This ash can reduce sunlight reaching the surface, creating darkness even during daylight hours. If volcanic activity coincided with the other plagues, extended darkness would result. What scientific validation reveals is not that the plagues were impossible. It reveals the opposite. The mechanisms for all 10 plagues exist in nature. The ecological cascade that would produce them follows predictable patterns. Understanding the science doesn't explain away the plagues. It explains how they happened. But here's what's remarkable. The timing of all these events in precise sequence is extraordinarily improbable through random chance. Scientists studying probability understand that simultaneous occurrence of multiple independent events becomes exponentially less likely as more events are involved. The probability of 2 rare events occurring together is lower than the probability of either event alone. The probability of 3 rare events occurring together is lower still. When we add the requirement that these events must occur in a specific sequence, with specific characteristics, the probability becomes vanishingly small. The 10 plagues aren't just individual disasters that happen to occur in ancient Egypt. They're a specific sequence of cascading events that occurred in a specific order with specific consequences. The probability of this occurring through random chance is so low that scientists studying complex systems would consider it effectively impossible. Yet it did occur. Egyptian records confirm it. The evidence exists. This creates an interesting situation for skeptics. They can't claim the plagues are scientifically impossible because science shows they're possible, but they also can't explain the probability of all 10 occurring in sequence as pure chance. What remains as an explanation is either that the events were directed by an intelligent force, or that an extraordinary confluence of circumstances aligned perfectly to produce exactly the sequence described in Exodus. The second option requires accepting what's sometimes called extreme coincidence. The first option requires accepting that an outside force capable of controlling natural systems directed the plagues for a specific purpose. Interestingly, the newly translated Egyptian documents hint at how contemporaries interpreted these events. Some passages in the recovered texts suggest understanding that the plagues resulted from divine action. Descriptions reference a power that controlled the events, that specifically spared one population while striking another. The tone suggests understanding that this wasn't random misfortune, but directed judgment. Other passages focus on the practical consequences, the destroyed crops, the dead livestock, the economic collapse. These are the records of administrators dealing with crisis. Each aid they're focused on response and recovery rather than theological interpretation. What emerges is a complex picture. Egyptians of the time understood that these were natural phenomena. Water does turn red through algae. Locusts do swarm. Hail does fall. Disease does spread. But they also understood that the specific convergence of all these events in this sequence was extraordinary. The descriptions in recovered texts show awareness that this was unusual, unprecedented, and outside normal experience. Whether that should be interpreted as divine intervention depends partly on one's philosophical framework. But what cannot be denied is that the events happened. The Egyptian records confirm it. Science explains the mechanisms. The evidence aligns. The final insight from scientific validation is something that skeptics rarely acknowledge. When you follow the evidence without predetermined conclusions, the evidence points toward the biblical account's accuracy. The plagues happened. They happened in the order Exodus describes. They had the consequences, the Bible states. They affected the population groups that Scripture indicates. Science doesn't prove God, but it does confirm that the accounts in Scripture accurately describe events that occurred. And sometimes, confirmation of accuracy is as significant as any explanation of mechanism. Understanding why these discoveries have remained hidden requires understanding how academic institutions function and what interests are served by maintaining particular historical narratives. For over a century, mainstream archaeology and Egyptology have been built on certain foundational assumptions. These assumptions aren't always conscious or explicitly stated. They're embedded in how institutions train scholars, what research gets funded, what papers get published, and what conclusions get promoted. One foundational assumption has been that religious texts should not be trusted as historical sources. The reasoning seems rational. Religious texts are theology, not history. They express spiritual truths, not factual records. Therefore, they shouldn't be treated as reliable guides to historical events. This assumption led to a methodological bias. When archaeological evidence could be interpreted as supporting biblical accounts, that interpretation was avoided. Alternative explanations were sought, no matter how strained. When evidence seemed to contradict biblical accounts, it was promoted and celebrated. This isn't a conscious conspiracy. It's a systematic bias embedded in academic culture. It's how institutions socialize their members. Scholars learn what interpretations are acceptable and what interpretations are career-limiting. The pressure is subtle, but effective. Universities built their reputations on this framework. Textbooks taught this framework. Scholars gained prominence by advancing research within this framework. When evidence emerged that contradicted the framework, the institutions had significant motivation to suppress it rather than revise it. This is where the newly translated papyri created a problem. The evidence from multispectral imaging was difficult to deny. The text was there. The descriptions matched the biblical account. The Egyptian records confirmed the plagues. But accepting these findings would require revising the foundational framework that academic institutions had maintained for a century. It would mean admitting that biblical accounts were more historically accurate than scholars had claimed. It would mean acknowledging that religious texts contained reliable historical information. It would mean revising textbooks, retraining scholars, and essentially apologizing for a century of misdirection. Institutions facing this situation didn't respond by openly debating the evidence. Instead, they used their power to control which evidence became public. Major academic journals rejected papers presenting the multispectral imaging findings. These rejections weren't based on methodological flaws in the research. They were based on bias against the conclusions. Or reviewers criticized papers for making connections to biblical narratives, as if the correlation itself was somehow improper. Universities that participated in multispectral imaging research faced funding pressures. Grant money from major funders dried up. Research priorities shifted away from plague-related projects. Scholars who published on these topics found career advancement difficult. This isn't unique to biblical archaeology. In other fields, when evidence contradicts institutional consensus, similar suppression occurs. The history of science shows repeated examples where evidence contradicting established frameworks was suppressed or dismissed until the original researchers died, and a new generation of scholars could revise the narrative. What's different about biblical archaeology is that the suppression serves particular ideological goals. For decades, academic institutions promoted the view that biblical accounts were unreliable and inferior to secular historical analysis. Accepting that biblical accounts accurately reflected historical events undermines this ideology. The suppression also served the interests of scholars who had built careers on arguing against biblical reliability. Admitting that the 10 plagues were real and documented in Egyptian records contradicts decades of published work arguing the opposite. Career-threatening admission is unlikely to happen voluntarily. Institutional suppression worked effectively for months. The multispectral imaging discoveries remained confined to academic circles and specialized journals that reached small audiences. The general public knew nothing about these findings. The suppression seemed successful, but technology and communication patterns have made complete suppression increasingly difficult. Once researchers completed their translations, copies began circulating among scholars not bound by mainstream institutional commitments. Academics at smaller universities with less dependence on major funding found freedom to publish their findings. Graduate students researching these topics shared information through channels institutions couldn't fully control. Most significantly, amateur historians and researchers began analyzing the data independently. The original multispectral imaging data became available. Anyone with technical knowledge could examine it. Anyone could make their own translations and comparisons. The information began leaking onto the internet. Videos explaining the discoveries appeared on alternative platforms. Researchers began publicly discussing the suppression, which paradoxically increased interest in the suppressed information. This is where the narrative shifted. Instead of the suppressed information being obscure academic details, the suppression itself became newsworthy. Why would major institutions suppress archaeological findings? What were they protecting? These questions triggered exactly the kind of public curiosity that suppression had been designed to prevent. Videos presenting these discoveries began circulating on YouTube and other platforms. Some were removed, some were suspended from recommendation algorithms. Some accounts were flagged or limited in reach. These actions, intended to suppress spread of the information, instead became evidence that suppression was occurring. People respond powerfully to information they're told is being hidden. The suppression created a Streisand effect, where attempting to silence information increases its visibility. By early 2025, versions of these discoveries had reached significant portions of the internet-connected public. The genie was out of the bottle. Complete suppression was no longer possible. Faced with this situation, academic institutions pivoted. Instead of continuing to suppress the information, they began attempting to control its interpretation. Academic papers were published, offering alternative interpretations of the multispectral imaging data. Scholars argued that the correlations between papyri descriptions and biblical accounts were coincidental. They suggested the dating was unreliable. They promoted interpretations that minimized the connections to the 10 plagues. Mainstream media outlets, which had initially ignored the story, began covering it with frames that downplayed the significance. They presented the discoveries as interesting but not definitively confirming the biblical account. They quoted skeptical scholars who maintained that the connections remained debatable. This phase of the suppression was more sophisticated than simple rejection. It acknowledged the discoveries while attempting to control their meaning. It transformed the question from, "Are the 10 plagues real?" to, "What do the discoveries mean?" This is the phase we're currently in. The information cannot be fully suppressed, but its implications can be managed if sufficient uncertainty remains about its significance. What the suppression narrative reveals is that truth doesn't emerge through neutral scientific process. It emerges through struggle between those committed to evidence and those committed to protecting institutional narratives. The 10 plagues were documented in Egyptian records. Technology has made this documentation visible. The evidence now exists in public view, but whether people accept this evidence as significant depends partly on resisting the narrative management that continues to this day. Ancient Egypt faced 10 plagues. Modern interpreters of biblical prophecy see patterns repeating in the Book of Revelation. The connection between these two events, separated by thousands of years, might seem like a stretch. But when you examine the descriptions carefully, the patterns become unmistakable. The 10 plagues of Exodus represent divine judgment. They were responses to a nation resisting the will of God. They were demonstrations of power over nature and human affairs. They escalated in severity until the desired outcome was achieved. The Book of Revelation describes similar patterns. The 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, and the 7 bowls represent escalating judgments. They progress in severity. They affect nature, human systems, and ultimately life itself. The descriptions, while using different specific examples, follow the same pattern as the Exodus plagues. The first plague of Egypt was water turning to blood. The first bowl of Revelation is blood poured into the sea, killing sea creatures and making the water like the blood of a dead man. Oh, the imagery is slightly different, but the core phenomenon is identical. Water turning to blood as judgment. The fourth plague of Egypt was darkness. The fifth bowl of Revelation involves darkness poured on the kingdom of the Antichrist. Again, the specific context differs, but the fundamental judgment is the same. The eighth plague of Egypt was locusts. Revelation describes locusts emerging from smoke, shaped like horses prepared for battle. The context is different, but the central element, locusts as instruments of judgment, repeats across both accounts. The pattern isn't just about specific phenomena. It's about the structure of judgment itself. In Exodus, plagues escalate in severity. Each plague affects Egypt more severely than the previous one. The cumulative effect is economic devastation, social breakdown, and ultimately forced change of Egyptian policy. In Revelation, the same pattern appears. The seals, trumpets, and bowls escalate in severity. Each judgment is more comprehensive than the previous one. The cumulative effect is social collapse, environmental destruction, and the fundamental restructuring of human civilization. Some interpret this as coincidence. Two ancient texts both use plagues as judgment metaphor. Of course, they would have similar elements, but the details suggest something deeper. The specific choice of plagues in Exodus, water turning blood, locusts, darkness, pestilence, are unusual choices if they're purely metaphorical. Why these specific phenomena? And why does Revelation use these same specific phenomena if it's not intentionally echoing the Exodus account? The most coherent interpretation is that both texts describe actual events. The 10 plagues of Egypt were real events with real consequences. Revelation describes similar real events that will occur in the future. The connection isn't metaphorical, it's sequential. History repeating with similar patterns and similar divine
The Golden Dome of the
purposes.
Rock sits on that
This
hill today,
interpretation
built in
becomes more
691
compelling when
AD.
you consider what the pattern reveals
This is the
about
Temple
divine
Mount,
action.
where King
If the 10
Solomon
plagues were a
built the
response
first
to
temple.
Pharaoh's resistance to divine will, what triggered them? The Exodus account presents the context. God wanted the Israelite people released from slavery. Pharaoh refused repeatedly. Each plague represented escalating pressure to force compliance. The pattern worked. After 10 plagues, Pharaoh released the Israelites. The plagues achieved their intended outcome. So, if Revelation describes a similar pattern, what is it responding to? According to Revelation, it's a response to humanity's continued rebellion against divine authority. Throughout history, humanity has resisted submission to divine will. Various empires have persecuted believers. Secular systems have consolidated power without regard for divine sovereignty. Revelation suggests that this pattern cannot continue indefinitely. At some point, escalating judgment will force ultimate change. The plagues of Revelation are the mechanism for this forced change. Understanding the Exodus plagues as a template for comprehending future events creates a specific framework for interpreting current history. In this framework, Revelation doesn't describe abstract spiritual reality. It describes concrete future events. The plagues aren't metaphors. They're descriptions of actual phenomena that will occur in the physical world. Water will become contaminated. Darkness will fall. Crops will fail. Diseases will spread. This interpretation connects the ancient records of the 10 plagues directly to modern prophecy. It suggests that what happened in Egypt provides a model for understanding what's coming. The pattern in Egypt was 7 plagues affecting nature and crops, followed by 3 plagues affecting people directly. The 9th and 10th plagues were the most severe, resulting in the death of the firstborn and forced change in policy. In Revelation, a similar pattern emerges. Multiple judgments affect nature and environmental systems. Then more severe judgments affect human systems directly. The pattern builds to a climax involving significant loss of human life and ultimately the restructuring of all human systems under new authority. For believers in this interpretive framework, the significance is profound. It suggests that the pattern of divine judgment is consistent. It's been demonstrated in history, it's predicted in prophecy, and it's repeating in the present. What makes this interpretation particularly compelling to modern believers is that the emerging global events seem to fit the pattern described in Revelation. Water contamination issues are increasing globally. Algae blooms affect major water systems. Fish populations decline. Water sources become unsafe. Atmospheric phenomena are creating unusual conditions. Extended darkness periods occur due to volcanic activity, dust storms, or atmospheric effects. Sunlight is reduced more frequently than historical norms. Crop failures are becoming more common. Climate disruption affects agricultural systems. Locust swarms have returned to regions after decades of absence. Pest populations are expanding. Disease outbreaks continue to emerge. Epidemics spread faster through modern transportation systems. New pathogens appear regularly. Medical systems struggle to respond to novel diseases. For those viewing current events through the lens of Revelation prophecy, these conditions appear to be the initial fulfillment of predicted judgments. The pattern described in ancient prophecy is manifesting in current reality. Whether this interpretation is accurate depends on perspective. Skeptics attribute these phenomena to natural variation, human activity, or cycles of environmental change. They don't require supernatural explanation or divine intervention. But for believers who see the pattern of judgment as consistent across Exodus, Revelation, and current events, the evidence of divine action becomes increasingly visible. The 10 plagues are no longer just history. They're not metaphor or theology. They're a template. They're proof that patterns of divine judgment are real, repeatable, and present in the fabric of history. The newly deciphered Egyptian papyri documenting the 10 plagues represent more than historical confirmation. For those tracking biblical prophecy, they represent evidence that the patterns of divine judgment are active in our present moment. Consider the current state of global water systems. Multiple major rivers and water bodies are experiencing contamination events. In recent years, algae blooms have affected water supplies in the United States, Europe, and Africa. These blooms don't just discolor water. They produce toxins harmful to human health. They kill fish populations. They disrupt ecosystems. In 2023 and 2024, several major drinking water sources were compromised by algae blooms. Communities had to issue water safety warnings. Hospitals treated illnesses related to contaminated water. Fishing industries experienced disruptions due to fish kills. This pattern aligns with the first plague of Egypt, water becoming contaminated and unsuitable for use. It's not a direct prophecy fulfillment. Rather, it's consistent with the pattern Revelation describes for the end times. Look at atmospheric phenomena. Extended periods of unusual darkness have occurred due to volcanic eruptions. The 2024 volcanic activity in various regions created atmospheric effects that reduced sunlight. In some areas, midday appeared twilight. The sun was dimmed visibly. Additionally, dust storms of unprecedented scale have affected multiple continents. Saharan dust reaching the Americas. Dust storms in the Middle East reducing visibility and creating health hazards. Smoke from extensive wildfires creating atmospheric haze that persists for weeks. These phenomena are consistent with the plague of darkness that Revelation describes. They're not necessarily supernatural, they're natural phenomena, but they're occurring with increasing frequency and severity. Crop failures are escalating globally. Climate disruption affects growing seasons. Hailstorms destroy crops and fields. Flooding disrupts agriculture. Drought stresses crops. And more dramatically, locust swarms have reappeared in regions where they've been absent for decades. East Africa experienced massive locust infestations in 2020 and subsequent years. These swarms destroyed crops and pasture land. They spread to regions previously unaffected. Agricultural productivity is declining in many regions. Food prices are rising. Supply chain disruptions affect food distribution. The pattern of crop failure and food scarcity that Revelation describes is increasingly apparent in global agricultural systems. Disease outbreaks continue to accelerate. The COVID-19 pandemic was merely one in a series of emerging infectious diseases. Monkeypox spread globally. Bird flu variants emerge regularly and new pathogens appear frequently. Medical systems struggle to respond to novel diseases. Antibiotic resistance increases, reducing treatment options. Hospital capacity is strained. Mortality from emerging diseases affects populations globally. This aligns with Revelation's description of pestilence as one of the final judgments. Most significantly, recognize the acceleration pattern. These phenomena are not occurring at steady rates. They're occurring with increasing frequency. Water contamination events are happening more often. Atmospheric disruptions are happening more frequently. Crop failures affect larger areas. Diseases spread faster. The escalation pattern described in Revelation, where judgments increase in severity and frequency, appears to be manifesting. For believers tracking prophecy, 2026 holds particular significance. Multiple factors are aligning that prophetic interpreters see as markers of the final period. The archaeological confirmation of the 10 plagues removes doubt about whether divine judgment in history was real. The evidence now publicly exists. The pattern is documented. The mechanism is confirmed. Combined with current global conditions increasingly matching the pattern described in Revelation, the interpretation that we're entering the final period of human history gains credibility. This doesn't mean immediate apocalyptic collapse. Revelation describes an extended period, not an instant ending, but it suggests that the current period differs qualitatively from previous periods. The pattern of divine judgment is active. The mechanisms are deploying. Consider what this means practically. If the pattern of Revelation is indeed manifesting, then preparation becomes important. This isn't preparation for an event months away, but preparation for a period of increasing disruption. Food security becomes a genuine concern when crops are failing and locust swarms are expanding. Water quality becomes critical when contamination events are accelerating. Health becomes a focus when disease emergence is accelerating. Energy systems become crucial when atmospheric phenomena are creating unstable conditions. Additionally, recognizing the pattern has spiritual implications. If the plagues represent divine judgment, then understanding that we're in a period of escalating judgment suggests we're approaching a time of ultimate consequence. The choices people make, the values they adopt, the authorities they submit to, these matter with increasing urgency. The Egyptian Papyri proving the 10 plagues were real transforms the discussion. It's no longer whether ancient biblical accounts are reliable. The evidence confirms they are. The question becomes, what does that confirmation mean for understanding the future? If God acted decisively in ancient Egypt, why not in modern times? If the pattern of escalating judgment achieved its purpose historically, why not currently? The most coherent interpretation of current events through the lens of validated biblical prophecy is that we're in an escalating period of divine judgment. Not unique judgment, but the standard pattern that's operated throughout history, now operating in our time. This interpretation has profound implications for how people understand current events. The chaos, the instability, the increasing disasters, these aren't random or merely the result of human mismanagement. They're the manifestation of a pattern, a template of judgment that's been operating consistently across history. What we've examined is more than history. It's more than archaeology. It's more than documentary evidence of past events. The deciphered papyri, the confirmation of the 10 plagues, the alignment with prophecy. All of this points toward a reality that extends beyond academic discussion. If the 10 plagues were real, and the evidence now confirms they were, then the entire framework of how we understand reality must shift. We cannot maintain the secular assumption that history is random, that events are driven by human agency alone, that divine intervention is impossible or undetectable. The existence of these Egyptian records, deliberately preserved and recently revealed, suggests something intentional about how history unfolds. Information doesn't emerge randomly. All understanding isn't granted without purpose. For believers, this realization creates urgency. If we're entering a period where patterns of divine judgment are accelerating, then alignment with divine will becomes the crucial question. This doesn't require specific religious denomination. Catholics, Protestants, Orthodox believers, Muslims, and others all recognize the same foundational truths. A divine power operates in history. Judgment falls on those who resist divine will, and ultimate consequences await those who don't align themselves properly. What becomes important in this moment is clarity about what matters. Political systems, economic status, social position, these are all temporary. What matters is spiritual position. Where do you stand relative to divine will? Whose authority do you recognize? Where is your loyalty? These questions become practical, not merely philosophical, when divine judgment is accelerating in history. Consider what this means for your present circumstances. You might be following career paths, accumulating possessions, pursuing status, all the goals that secular society promotes. But if we're entering a period of increasing disruption and judgment, these goals become questionable. What good is career advancement if the economic system that provides employment becomes destabilized? What value is accumulated wealth if systems of commerce break down? What security does social status provide if the social structures supporting it collapse? Conversely, what becomes truly valuable? Community that will support you through disruption, family relationships that sustain through crisis, skills that remain valuable when systems change. Most importantly, spiritual clarity about what you believe and why you believe it. The call to spiritual awakening isn't call to panic. It's call to prioritize correctly, to recognize that the pattern of judgment is real, that consequences are real, and that alignment with what you understand to be true becomes the most important focus. For some, this means deepening religious practice. For others, it means examining what you actually believe versus what you've been taught to believe. For still others, it means accepting that something larger than yourself operates in history and aligning your choices with that reality. What it means for everyone is this: you cannot continue life as before, not because external circumstances will force change, though they will, but because understanding changes everything. Once you recognize that the 10 plagues were real, that divine judgment is real, that prophecy is being fulfilled, you cannot maintain the illusion that these are merely historical curiosities or religious ideas.
The Golden
with
Dome
no
of the Rock sits on
real-world
that hill today,
implications.
built in
The
691
Papyri prove
AD.
these ideas have real-world implications.
This is the Temple
They
Mount,
prove
where
that
King
faith
Solomon
isn't
built
based
the
on
first
delusion.
temple.
They prove that reality is more complex and significant than secular frameworks acknowledge. This realization creates responsibility. You now know something most people don't know. The evidence exists. The pattern is visible. What will you do with this knowledge? Some will dismiss it. They'll rationalize why the evidence doesn't matter, or why the patterns aren't significant. This is their choice. But awareness makes a difference. It creates responsibility to yourself to be honest about what you now understand. Others will integrate this understanding into how they live. They'll make different choices based on recognizing that we're in a special period. They'll invest in what matters. They'll prepare for what's coming. They'll align themselves with what they understand to be true. The deciphered papyri don't just reveal history. They reveal that truth matters, that evidence exists, that reality includes dimensions far beyond what secular narrative acknowledges. The call to spiritual awakening is simply this: recognize what the evidence shows. Accept the implications. Align your life accordingly. What we haven't yet discussed, what the institutions absolutely do not want public attention focused on, is the most extraordinary aspect of the newly translated papyri. Among the sections that multispectral imaging revealed, buried beneath centuries of deliberate erasure, was a passage that changes everything about how we understand what's coming next. This passage describes something beyond the 10 plagues. It references a prophecy, not an Egyptian prophecy. The newly translated sections indicate that this prophecy came from Moses himself, delivered directly to the Pharaoh during the plague period. The description in the papyri is fragmentary. Sections are damaged. Some words remain unclear, but the message is unmistakable. Moses delivered to the Pharaoh a warning about events that would unfold in the distant future, events that matched precisely what Revelation describes. This is what the academic suppression has primarily protected. Not just the historical confirmation of the 10 plagues, but the awareness that Moses provided prophecy that has remained encoded in Egyptian records for 3,000 years. The newly recovered sections of this prophecy describe environmental catastrophes. They describe social breakdown. They describe the emergence of a system of control that enslaves humanity in a way far more comprehensive than Egyptian slavery. Most significantly, they describe the timing. The sections that remain legible include references to cycles, to patterns repeating, to a final period when all previous judgments culminate in ultimate transformation. Researchers analyzing the newly translated material have made estimates about when this final period begins. And the dates mentioned in the manuscript correlate to specific time markers in our modern calendar. That correspondence places the beginning of this final period in your lifetime. Not decades away, not centuries away, years away at most. The papyri describe preparation for those who recognize the pattern. They describe protection for those who understand and align themselves accordingly. They describe judgment for those who continue in resistance. But here's what's most important. The prophecy in the papyri doesn't predict doom without offering a path forward. It describes both judgment and redemption, both ending and beginning. The academic institutions have tried to keep this information hidden because its implications are staggering. Once people understand that ancient Egyptian records contain prophecy about our current moment, once people recognize that the pattern described is manifesting in real time, the entire framework of modern civilization becomes questionable. People would begin asking, what are they hiding? Why keep this suppressed? What happens if ordinary people understood that their moment in history is exactly the moment ancient prophecy describes? Governments, corporations, academic institutions, media organizations, all benefit from keeping people focused on temporary concerns. Career advancement, consumer goods, entertainment, political disputes. These distractions disappear entirely if people understand that we're in the final period of history, as we know it. The question you must ask yourself, now that you know this, what will you do? The full translations are being finalized. The papyri sections are being carefully studied. What emerges from these remaining translations will be released in subsequent discoveries. The truth will surface. The suppression will fail. But by the time this information reaches mainstream awareness, the period described in the prophecy may already be well underway. Will you understand what's happening when it begins? Will you recognize the pattern? Or will you be among those who miss the significance of the transformation occurring around them? The answer depends on what you do now with what you've learned.